Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, friends, everybody who is interested in Helsinki Final Act and its influence. We are going on with a session about religion in the process. Religion was not that much mentioned so far. One quote from Augustine, and it was almost all. But religion is not to be left out from the social and political processes in 20th century. And now we will see what was the influence of Helsinki Final Act and related processes to the religious freedom as human right, among others. So we have a panel which was initiated by the network which does research about religion in Cold War, and several members of this panel are also members of this network. So we will have first a bit longer lecture by Sarah Snyder, and then we will have 4 panelists who will have each 10 minutes to go on from this paper and from their own angles. And then we will go on with Q&A, and you will have a chance to give your own comments, ask questions, and we will discuss the issues. So I will shortly introduce all our panelists, and starting from chairman, we have 2 chairs for this panel. Myself, I'm Riho Altnurme, I'm professor of church history at the University of Tartu, Estonia, and my research area has been mostly Soviet time churches and politics, and included society. Another chair is Professor Leon van der Broeke from the Utrecht Theological University, and he's a professor of theology of law and church law, canon law, and his research area has been also church, state, and society. So our panelists, first speaker, Sarah Snyder, is a historian from the School of International Service, American University, Washington, D.C., who specializes in the influence of non-state actors, such as human rights activists and overseas Americans, on US foreign relations. The titles of her books speak for themselves: Human Rights Activism and the End of the Cold War, a Transnational History of the Helsinki Network, published 2011, From Selma to Moscow, How Human Rights Activists Transformed US Foreign Policy, from 2018, and the CSCE and the End of the Cold War, Diplomacy, Societies and Human Rights, 1972-1990, published also in 2018. Dr. Reka Feldvärn-Kish, he is a historian, ethnographer who has worked on several academic positions at the universities in Hungary, and she is chairperson of the Committee of National Remembrance of Hungary, already since 2014. Next, Katharina Kunter, you know her, of course, professor of contemporary church history at the Faculty of Theology at the University of Helsinki. Already in her PhD thesis, which was published year 2000, she analyzed the role of churches during the 1970s and 10th period, and how Christian actors advocated for dialogue, democracy, and human rights in divided Europe. Christian political opposition in communist Central and Eastern Europe has continuously been one of her research topics. She is one of the initiators of the Religion and Cold War Research Network, RICONET, and this conference as well. Katharina McLarren is a senior research fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law in Heidelberg. In her doctoral dissertation, she focused on religion and international society, approaches to including religion in the international relations research agenda. Further research areas include diplomacy studies and foreign policy analysis. And last but not least, Erik Sidenvall, professor of practical theology at the Lund University. He is interested in questions of spatiality and religion, the religious materiality of everyday life, but he has also worked on questions on the organization of churches and Christian communities. He is also one of the initiators of the Religion and Cold War network. So, I will pass the floor for our first presenter, Sarah Snyder. Please.
Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really delighted and honored to be at Finlandia Hall, where the Helsinki Final Act was signed 50 years ago. So many of us here in this room have written about or participated in this process for years, and it's so wonderful to be in the place where this, not where it all began, as we have heard, but a very key moment in the Helsinki process. So what I want to do this afternoon is give a short introduction to this panel by talking about how believers and their faith influenced Helsinki activism. And what I'm going to talk about, I believe, are some historical actors that will be known to you and some that may be less familiar. Okay. Turns out it was maybe better before. Okay, so what I want to begin by doing is by emphasizing that faith, broadly conceived, was an integral part of the Helsinki Final Act. The seventh principle stated that respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, including the freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief. And further down in the text of this principle, the agreement said, within this framework, the participating states will recognize and respect the freedom of the individual to profess and practice, alone or in community with others, religion or belief, acting in accordance with the dictates of his own conscience. And I think it's quite important that these protections were not limited to formal religious practice or belief, but also included thought, conscience, and even non-belief. So these protections were due to the initiative of several diplomats and the states that they represented. But in my reading of the diplomatic record that produced the Helsinki Final Act, the efforts of the Vatican, which I sort of came to think of as a state that was really a single-issue voter or a single-issue representative, were tireless in their intention that protections for religious freedom be part of the concluding document. And we see this again and again, that their role in the negotiations were significant beyond the size of the city-state. And I think that this connection between the Vatican city-state and its concern was further amplified when Pope John Paul II wrote to the CSCE heads of state that had gathered for the Madrid Review meeting in November of 1980 about freedom of religion and conscience. He was making really a direct appeal to them. Now, as I mentioned, his statement fit with the long-standing Vatican interest in religious freedom, but it also aligned with his personal anti-communism and his efforts to influence change in his home country, including, as we heard last night, through his call to fellow Poles in 1978 to be not afraid. Now, there were a number of key individuals that were prominent in my research that were drawn into Helsinki activism based on their faith. And I want to first talk about Father Robert Drinan. He was a Catholic priest who was elected to the United States House of Representatives. He was a Democrat from the state of Massachusetts, and he was active legislatively on the issue of Soviet Jewish emigration dating at least to 1971. And for that reason, in August of 1975, he was on a congressional delegation to the Soviet Union. And he was in Moscow when Soviet officials published the Helsinki Final Act in Soviet newspapers. He was with Soviet dissident Andrei Sakharov and Jewish refusenik Anatoly Sharansky, and he reported that they were amazed but jubilant to read the full text of the Helsinki Final Act in Soviet newspapers. Because of his interactions with them in Moscow, he became really galvanized about the significance of the Helsinki Final Act. And he talked to Soviet officials while he was there about what were the obstacles to Jewish emigration. Why was this something that they were preventing? When he returned to the United States, he took a number of other steps. For example, he sent a list of refusenick names that he had collected in Moscow to the US-based organization, the National Conference on Soviet Jewry. And then he followed up with letters to Soviet officials on behalf of those who were seeking exit visas. He also wrote a report on the state of religious freedom in the Soviet Union for the National Catholic Reporter. And in it he wrote, quote, "I would like to write that there are signs of hope for religious freedom in the USSR. I cannot. Some 500,000 Christian Baptists have a state-sponsored religious group, but some 100,000 Christian dissidents operate underground, with an estimated 300 of their activists in jail." And I think in his reflections here, writing for the National Catholic Reporter, but about the plight of Baptists and other Christian dissidents, he reveals that his interest in the plight of the faithful extended beyond those who shared his own religion, Catholicism. Now, his experiences in Moscow and his concern about religious freedom broadly drew him to participation in the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, a US government body charged with monitoring compliance with the Helsinki Final Act and a key actor in the transnational Helsinki network. Spurred by the interests of Drynen and others, the Commission held a hearing on religious freedom in the Soviet Union in April 1977, and more would follow. In these hearings, they invited experts, people like Peter Redaway of Keston College's Center for the Study of Religion and Communism, who testified about religious activists in the Soviet Union who were using the Helsinki Final Act in their demands of Soviet authorities. Now, the dissidents that Redaway was testifying about had reported on repression of religious activists, as well as other human rights activists, in outlets such as the Chronicle of Current Events. This was a samizdat or self-published newsletter that reported about Soviet rights violations going back to the late 1960s. As a member of the commission, Robert Drynen later participated in the Madrid meeting, and he suggested there that a new era for human rights was being born. I want to turn now to one of the Soviet human rights activists that alerted Robert Drynen to the Helsinki Final Act's potential, and this is Anatoly Sharansky. Now, one element that made Helsinki activism in the Soviet Union distinct was that it brought together heretofore diverse human rights groups, or human rights activists. As one activist at the time wrote, the Helsinki process enabled, quote, the unification of the human rights movement with religious and national movements. And we can see this reflected concretely in the identities and interests of the 11 founding members of the Moscow Helsinki group, of which Sharansky was one. The group was made up of Jewish refuseniks, human rights activists, and those focused on the rights of national minorities. According to its founders, the Moscow Helsinki group was intended as a bridge between different activists focused on religious, ethnic, and economic issues, as well as between workers and intellectuals. Now, Sharansky represented those who were fighting to the right to observe Judaism within the Soviet Union and the right to emigrate if the right to practice one's own religion continued to be denied. He remembers, you see, there were Zionists and monarchists, Russians and Ukrainians and Belarusians, and even Euro-communists, I'd say, people of absolutely different views. There were those who wanted to leave, like myself or Vitaly Rubin, who was another Soviet refusnik, and those who were concerned about the situation in Soviet prisons and camps, and those who were concerned mainly about religious freedoms. But all of us were united by the Helsinki group. Born Jewish, Sharansky had little knowledge of his religion and no attachment to Israel until the Six-Day War in 1967, which he reports stirred his interest in and pride in the country. When he finished his education in mathematics and computer science, he applied to emigrate to Israel in 1973. After his visa was denied, Sharansky took part in many short-lived protests to draw attention to the plight of Soviet Jews and refuseniks like himself. In this period, Sharansky met Avital Stieglitz, and they married in July 1974, the day before she emigrated to Israel, with the belief that he would soon follow. Instead, Sharansky's visa applications were repeatedly denied, and his increased activism led to increased KGB surveillance. Sharansky had become involved in the Moscow-Helsinki group due to a broader commitment to human rights that had led him to work closely with Sakharov, helping Sakharov facilitate contacts with foreign journalists. Ultimately, the KGB arrested Sharansky on March 15, 1977, alleging that he had slandered the Soviet Union with Moscow-Helsinki group documents. He was charged with anti-Soviet activity and even treason. Sharansky was imprisoned for 16 months before the completion of his trial, and then sentenced to 13 years, 3 in prison and 10 in a strict labor camp. He alternated between prison and labor camps for the next 8 years, repeatedly conducting hunger strikes to protest prison authorities' interference with his correspondence with his family. He ultimately endured 9 years of imprisonment until an international campaign led by his wife Avital aided his liberation. Although the international outcry surrounding his arrest and imprisonment had little impact on his case initially, over time, the movement, which was joined by scientists, Jews, human rights activists, and many others moved by his case, may have kept him alive and eventually secured his release. After his release, Sharansky wrote, "Later, after my release, I learned that tens of thousands of people all around the world had written to me during my imprisonment. None of these letters ever reached me, and I was never informed about their existence. In all probability, they were burned. But although I never received them, it was extremely important that these letters were sent. To the regime, they served as a constant reminder that people all over the world knew about me and cared about my fate. This is why the authorities sometimes retreated, and it probably explains why they kept me alive during my prolonged hunger strike in 1982. Now, Sharansky was someone whose faith, frustration with his ability to practice it, and longing to emigrate inspired him to take action in the context of the Helsinki Final Act, and he suffered significantly for doing so. I want to turn to talking about someone inspired by a different faith, operating from a very different level of power. And this is US President Jimmy Carter. The United States, and over time its NATO allies, were determined to highlight Helsinki violations at the Belgrade follow-up meeting that opened in 1977. And Carter was key to this approach to the negotiations. His support for the US-based commission, correspondence with Soviet dissidents such as Andrei Sakharov, and advocacy for an aggressive approach at the first CSCE follow-up meeting were rooted in his stated commitment to make the protection of human rights central to his foreign policy. Now, his approach to human rights had many motivations, including political ones. But Carter's emphasis on human rights was also fundamentally grounded in his deeply held Baptist faith. The principal executor of Carter's approach to the CSCE negotiations at Belgrade was the US Ambassador Arthur Goldberg. Goldberg became somewhat infamous among CSCE diplomats because he challenged international diplomatic norms by naming names and citing individual cases in his speeches at Belgrade. His statements conveyed problems of Helsinki implementation in a forthright manner, often with specific details. In the view of his aide, Alfred Friendly Jr., Goldberg's concern about the Soviet treatment of Jews shaped his tactics at Belgrade. Friendly said, quote, "Arthur was a highly political Jew and truly sensitive to Soviet behavior toward its Jewish citizens. Goldberg's tactics represented a shift in international diplomacy and ultimately strengthened the Helsinki process by imbuing the follow-up meetings with real repercussions. Furthermore, progress at Belgrade ensured that such a discussion would recur in Madrid in 1980. In the CSCE meetings that followed Belgrade, faith and a commitment to religious freedom continued to inspire and shape the negotiations. These individuals, Robert Drennan, Anatoly Sharansky, Jimmy Carter, and Arthur Goldberg, as well as others committed to religious freedom, ensured that the issue would become a benchmark in assessing Helsinki implementation. Therefore, I think it's notable that it was religious freedom that Eastern European leaders pointed to in their speeches in some of the late Cold War Helsinki meetings to signal the changes taking place within their borders and in their broader region. For example, the Hungarian foreign minister in May of 1989 said, "The Hungarian People's Republic is serious about and wishes to comply fully with its CSCE commitments, including its obligations relating to the human dimension. This is in keeping with the deep democratic, social, and political reforms taking place in our country, with our concrete measures to create a state of law. An outstanding place among those measures is taken by legislation adopted or to be adopted, destined to enforce human rights, such as those on citizens' rights to association, the right to assembly, the right to establish economic associations, and the freedom of conscience and religion. A new constitution is in the process of elaboration, which is to give prominence to and a detailed listing of these internationally accepted norms of human rights. Similarly, in his opening statement at the Copenhagen meeting on the human dimension in June of 1990, the Czechoslovakian Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs said, quote, "We, that is at least we in my country, have enough reasons to believe that Helsinki 1975 was a turning point in the struggle for the restoration of democracy and for the removal of totalitarian political systems. The attention paid by the participants in the Helsinki deliberations to questions concerning respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, including freedom of thought, conscience, religion, and opinion, amounted to setting out along the right path and has proved to become the decisive principle on the basis of which a new situation has ultimately arisen, not only in my country, but in the whole area of Central and Eastern Europe." So to conclude, it was the eventual transformation of Soviet and Eastern European attitudes toward dissent, religion, and emigration that represented fundamental shifts, which enabled Gorbachev's talk about the Soviet Union sharing a common home with Europe to be imbued with real meaning. Now, I've tried quickly to show that these reforms were shaped by the activism of political leaders, diplomats, non-governmental organizations, and private individuals who were motivated by their faith and commitment to religious freedom. And I look forward to hearing more from my fellow panelists about churches and religious groups as underestimated actors in the CSCE process. Thank you.
Being perfect in timing also. And now the word for Reka Kish.
May I have the presentation, please? The PPT. Where can I change? No? Okay, then I... Yes, I know. Okay, yes. Thank you. So, first of all, I would like to thank you for the invitation into this panel. I find this topic particularly relevant because I completely agree that the religious communities have often remained on the margins of historical political analysis of the Cold War era. In my brief introduction, I will present a case study from a Hungarian perspective, not only because it is the most familiar context for me, and not only because Dr. Snyder mentioned or quoted the Hungarian Minister of Foreign Affairs, but also because within the Soviet bloc, Hungary had a unique position in terms of church policy. This was due to its multi-denominational religious landscape where Catholics, Protestant, and Jewish communities coexisted, but also because Hungary served as an experimental ground for all actors involved, for Soviet and Hungarian foreign policy, for the Holy See and international Protestant organizations, and for, which is a very important actor, for state security and intelligence services as well. And all these deeply influenced the framework within the Christian communities live their religious life. So to understand, where can I? No? Could you? Always the. Okay, then I can leave. So, to understand the underlying dynamics, we must begin in a Hungarian case, always we must begin with the 56 revolution, a general experience that profoundly shaped the political reflexes of the Kádár regime, with a central imperative: 56 must never happen again. Therefore, after brutal reprisals, the regime shifted tactics. Overt terror was gradually replaced by less visible yet highly effective mechanisms of political control. The regime's stability rested on three main pillars: improving living standards, known as goulash communism of Kadar regime, pragmatic engagement with the West, which was crucial for maintaining relative prosperity, but never deviating from Moscow strategy's directives, and the systematic depolitization of public discourse. Now I don't know where we are. Okay. So the church... Okay, never mind. So the church policy reflected this duality. On the one hand, in the early 1960s, the Kadar regime launched its largest coordinated, thank you, it's okay. Okay, now we are find our, that's a good slide. So on the one hand, in the early 90s, the Kadar regime launched its largest coordinated state security operation against Christian youth leaders. It was the so-called Black Relevance operation, referring, the clerical reaction, resulting in the arrest of more than 100 priests and lay people, some of whom remained imprisoned well into the 70s. However, after Helsinki, this sort of large-scale arrest of Christian activists could no longer be sustained. Instead, state security refined and intensified its methods, resorting to infiltration, blackmail, and disinformation to erode trust and isolate religious groups. Repression shifted from overt violence to more hidden forms of control. Okay, my second point, that on the other hand, at the level of high politics, Kadar's foreign policy and church diplomacy was largely perceived as pragmatic compromises or mediation. Notably, its first gestures of détente took place through church diplomacy. This approach yielded several high-profile diplomatic successes. In 1964, Hungary signed the first partial agreement between the Holy See and the Soviet bloc country, paving the way for the Vatican's Ostpolitik. In 1971, the regime resolved the so-called long-standing Mindszenty question, forcing the cardinal to leave the US embassy after 15 years. And after Helsinki in 1977, a historic meeting between Pope Paul VI and János Kádár took place in the Vatican. It was the first such encounter between a communist leader and the Pope, and widely interpreted as a diplomatic breakthrough. And in 1977, the Kádár regime hosted Billy Graham, the globally renowned Baptist evangelist, long associated with anti-communism. It was also a controversial issue. While the regime gained prestige for its tolerance, the event also re-energized revivalist religious communities in Hungary. And for Billy Graham, it opened the door to other countries in the Soviet bloc. And in the immediate aftermath, Jimmy Carter, who was not only a Baptist but also a friend of Billy Graham, authorized the return of the Hungarian crown of St. Stephen from the United States to Hungary, to the Hungarian people, but as a Christian national symbol into the hands of a communist state, highlighting the complex intertwining of symbolism, diplomacy, and détente under the Helsinki framework. My next point is the rise of grassroots religious opposition. While official church leadership remained under close state supervision and served to legitimize the regime, the 1970s saw the rise of grassroots religious communities. These groups not only resisted state authority, but sometimes also challenged the legitimacy of church leaders seen as politically compromised. One of the regime's most sensitive areas was conscientious objection to military service. The best-known case was the Catholic movement called Bokor, led by a Pierist monk, György Bulányi. His case also illustrates how repression was now often outsourced and internalized within religious structures. Then, my fourth point, the ethnic Hungarian minority churches and the human rights discourse. I think one of the most far-reaching consequences of the Helsinki process was the reframing of the ethnic and religious minority issue within international human rights discourse, particularly in Ceausescu, Romania, where the dismantling of the Hungarian language education affected deeply the Hungarian religious groups, especially the Reformed church communities. What had once been a taboo became a legitimate concern in international forums. Hungarian emigre organizations, most notably the Hungarian Human Rights Foundation, raised the issue effectively, especially in the US political and media circles. These efforts not only defended minority rights, but also served larger geopolitical aims by amplifying and many times exploiting religious and ethnic conflicts within the Soviet bloc. The best known figure is probably in this process was László Tőkés, a Reformed priest, later a pivotal voice in the 1989 revolution, but already an active in human rights advocacy during the early 1980s. Western NGOs like Amnesty International began documenting this case. And my last point, the Protestant solidarity networks and cross-border activism. The Hungarian religious minority questions became not only a political but also a spiritual cause within Protestant circles in Hungary and, what is more important, abroad. Informal and institutional solidarity networks emerged, mobilizing aid, advocacy, and underground cooperation across borders. Dozens of Hungarian congregations smuggled religious samizdat, food, medicine, and Bibles into Romania and later into the Ukrainian part of the Soviet Union. On this slide, you can see a few examples of those actors who was involved in this transnational network, clergymen from Hungary and Transylvania, whose congregations served as logistical center for aid efforts. And I brought two Dutch examples, Klaas and Ida Elzering, if I pronounce well, a couple of Reformed pastors from Netherlands delivered aid in person, and Broeke, sorry for the pronunciation, coordinated a complete secret international support networking from the Netherlands. Of course, it must be added that none of these processes would have been possible without the tacit support of the different actors of the power. But these solidarity efforts not only helped sustain persecuted communities, but also contributed to building transnational civil networks. And last remark, behind the facade of this complex, multifaceted church diplomacy stood another, less visible architecture, that of intelligence operations. In 1955, a state security coordination conference in Moscow, led by the KGB chief Ivan Serov, assigned Hungary a key role in infiltrating the Vatican and other religious institutions. While Catholic targets dominated the 1960s, the 1970s brought increased attention to Protestant organizations, with considerable successes. Archival evidence suggests that it was one of the most successful part of the Hungarian Secret Service operations. Thousands of pages of different reports survived, unfortunately only fragmentary, but still from all these stories, probably this Hungarian case offers a complex but instructive model for understanding how religious policy, transnational networks, and intelligence operation intersected within the broader context of detente and ideological containment during the Helsinki process. Thank you. 10 minutes is very short.
Will not comment on time. Please, Katharina, Kunter.
Allow me just to begin with a rather unflattering conclusion, and one that might surprise in terms of the name of our panel. I think there was no distinctively Christian contribution to the 1975 Helsinki Final Act or to the Helsinki process as a whole. This absence is not due to a lack of moral or religious concern or engagement. Rather, it reflects, and now I'm taking on the church historical perspective, it reflects the structural diversity and fragmentation of Christianity in Europe, which is deeply embedded in the political and ecclesiastical frameworks of each country. To put it simply, the churches were and are far too plural to speak with a single unified voice, and that is also the reason why it's not easy to speak, or why I can't speak from a homogeneous Christian contribution to the Helsinki process. At the same time, the church role in the Helsinki process depends heavily on the interpretation which spirit of Helsinki are we speaking about, and who is invoking it and in what context. For some, and we had that in the first panel of today, the Helsinki process was primarily a geopolitical tool of deterrent, a way to curb the Soviet expansion by balancing East-West relations through dialogue. And for others, it was something more, a moral and political catalyst that gave fresh momentum to the human rights cause. Both interpretations have influential historical or historiographical champions. Already mentioned in the first panel, Henry Kissinger, for example, leaned forward the former geopolitics first. And meanwhile, to name another great politician, the former German President Joachim Gauck, always have emphasized in his writings the latter, the mobilization power of Helsinki's human rights language. And the churches, as integral parts of their societies, they embodied both dimensions. And that dual role is what I would like to explore with you today a little bit more, focusing particularly more on the Protestant tradition. And I'm very sorry that our speaker, Massimo Fagioli, who would have speak about the Catholic Church and the Vatican, is not available here today. I will reframe my remarks to two key propositions. And the first one, I would like to put it, the Helsinki process opened new spaces of freedom for churches and Christians. It enabled, for the first time after the Second World War, greater East-West cooperation. It introduced new patterns of dialogue, and it strengthened the ecumenical ties across the Iron Curtain. This idea of dialogue, so central to détente, entered the churches as a new ecumenical communication model. This development raised the political relevance of the transnational religious organizations, such as the World Council of Churches, the Lutheran World Federation, or above all, the Conference of European Churches. It was the Conference of European Churches that already in 1966 advocated for a European Security Conference, and it was influenced in doing that by figures or church figures like the Metropolitan Philaret from the Soviet Union, and the Russian Orthodox Church was member of the Conference of European Churches. And after 1975, the Conference of the European Churches largely adopted in this line the Soviet idea of, let's say, peaceful coexistence as their guiding framework. So this interpretation of church diplomacy gave the Conference of European Churches new relevance, political relevance, but also ecclesiastical relevance, and it gave it new visibility, but also this all came at a cost. Looking through the documents of the late 1970s, we see that official church statements started and began to mirror secular diplomatic language more than the language of the gospel or the language of theology. Peace was more and more invoked in these official statements, but it was rarely defined. And also we see that the theological voice was muted more and more by political caution. A similar tendency can be observed in the World Council of Churches. While the World Council of Churches supported the CSCE from early on, its focus always remained on the arms control and maintaining the European status quo. Furthermore, it viewed Helsinki and the Helsinki process, the Final Act of Helsinki, as a regional concern and not as a global Christian mandate. And finally, a short look on the Lutheran World Federation, a church organization which is particularly important here in Northern Europe. In the Helsinki process, the Lutheran World Federation took a similar path as the Vatican, putting a strong focus on religious freedom in Eastern Europe. One person stands out here, and I would like to mention him. It was Risto Lehtonen, later Finnish bishop, a Finnish pastor who served as the official CSCE observer for the Lutheran World Federation. And also, while the whole diplomatic process was starting in Geneva and in Helsinki, he always was a sort of mediator between the Vatican and the Lutheran World Federation. Together with his Danish colleague Paul Hansen, Risto Lehtonen made clever use of the humanitarian dimension of Basket 3 in the Helsinki Final Act. They sent theological books and Bibles into the Soviet Union, and in 1976 they became the first foreign visitors since World War II to reach out Lutheran congregations in Siberia and Central Asia republics. This kind of high-level ecclesiastical engagement, however, also had its limitations. It was largely, as we would put it today, the track one diplomacy, official structures from above and tightly controlled. And that brings me to my second point. The Helsinki process became a source of moral and religious energy for human rights movements, often driven by Christians who stood in opposition to both the state and also to their own church leadership and those people who were maintaining the ecumenical contacts between East and West. As we know, Basket 3 and the Principle 7, and I just would like to remind that the Principle 7 was included and was fostered by the Vatican, with their focus on human rights, became powerful sources of inspiration for dissidents across Eastern and Central Europe. The Moscow and Ukrainian Helsinki groups were formed already in 1976, followed by the Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia. In East Germany, things took a little bit longer, but the Initiative for Peace and Human Rights were founded finally in the 1986 and can be seen as a sort of Helsinki group. Christians, pastors, and lay people alike were often deeply involved in these groups, even if they are not visible as Christians in these political activities. And yet, they were often stigmatized by both the state on the one side and then their own church's leadership. They were labeled as dissidents, troublemakers, or worse, as counter-revolutionaries. Many of them faced surveillance, repression, and exile. And for the clergy, it could mean also losing the right to preach or being forced underground. From a scholarly perspective in church history, we know more and more about those people, those Christians, the networks and organizations involved. In Switzerland, for example, the Glaube in der Zweiten Welt, Faith in the Second World Association, supported dissident Christians in Eastern Europe. In the Netherlands, peace activists like Mintjan Faber, Jan Terlaak, or Laurens Hogebrink forged bonds with Christian dissenters behind the Iron Curtain. And in the GDR, there could be many mentioned, but I would like to mention Ludwig Mehlhorn, people like him who were starting to make first contacts with Polish oppositional figures, got motivation for their own political oppositional activities in the GDR. But despite of all this, we still know too little about the role of religion and the spirituality in the formation of the dissident movements. What role did community, emotional support, and shared faith play? How important were images, songs, narratives, theology, and of course, from a Protestant perspective, biblical narratives? Why did Christian belief lead some of them to compliance and others into resistance? In the Helsinki process, we see Christianity at a crossroad, as diplomatic actor and moral conscience, as institution and movement, as dialogue partner and prophetic voice. But we also see many broken life stories, and we also see guilt caused by the churches themselves. And that too is part of the legacy of the Helsinki Final Act. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Another perfect timing. And please, Katharina, McLarren.
I also have a presentation, if you could start that, please. I'd already like to say thank you very much for having me. This is an absolute pleasure. As a political scientist, I'm learning a lot listening to historians, and I hope that I can also add another angle, especially from the perspective of international relations, where religion also continues to be a neglected aspect. And what I'll be doing today, let me just wait just one moment until we're at the beginning. Okay. Not quite. I can already reveal the title of my talk, which is From Igniting to Reviving the Helsinki Spirit, Silence, Diplomacy, and the Catholic Church. So I've decided to focus on one aspect or one actor, and we've already heard about maybe the role of the Holy See during Helsinki, and also leading up to the Helsinki Final Act. But I would like to also follow Mr. Rogulski, who was saying yesterday that we're allowed to or called upon to ask some questions. So I will raise some questions, which I hope will also spark some debate. We're unfortunately still not at the beginning of the talk, and I need to show you the slides because there's some important quotes there. So just one moment, please. Okay, so this is the beginning. Let's see. Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. So the title itself already indicates that and at this conference we want to speak about the Helsinki spirit then and now, and I'd like to build a bridge from then to now, and I'll be focusing on the Ukraine war, which I could have added to the title, but it would have become too long. So igniting to reviving, the Holy See itself spoke of igniting the Helsinki spirit in 1975, but now it is also one of the actors saying or calling for reviving. And we can only revive, or we need to revive something if it's almost dead. So I'd like to look at what happened to the Helsinki spirit, and especially what this means for Holy See diplomacy. I'm also especially interested in looking at the Holy See because I find this is one of the most important diplomatic actors. When studying diplomacy, this is clearly the longest existing diplomatic actor. And I argue that by studying the Holy See, we can also learn more about how diplomacy has evolved, but maybe also what has happened to the international society, or what Professor Morgan was speaking of earlier about the international order, how that has evolved. So we see here that for the Holy See, not just for the representative Cardinal Casaroli, but also for Pope Paul VI, they saw Helsinki as a turning point. And I would like to make the argument today that the Ukraine war is another turning point for Holy See diplomacy. We can see this here. So we see some quotes here by different representatives of the Catholic Church and the Holy See, where you can see that there's a call for reigniting, reviving, giving birth to a new spirit of Helsinki. And if we look at the years when these were given, these quotes, we all see that this is since the full-scale invasion by Russia of the Ukraine. And that's why I would like to make the argument that the Ukraine is a turning point for Holy See diplomacy. So what I'd like to do in the next couple of minutes is go backwards. So we're starting with today and looking at
Holy See diplomacy, and I have to apologize to Mr. Jantowski, I will talk about narratives today. That's what the Holy See has to offer. It doesn't have military capabilities, obviously. So we see a narrative that the Holy See has adopted since the full-scale invasion in 2022 is speaking of the United Nations and overall the international system as being powerless and paralyzed, for example, as being dysfunctional, not just the United Nations, but the entire multilateral system, and even impotent. And this is actually as early as 2022, Pope Francis spoke of the impotence of the organizations of the United Nations. And this is a huge, we can say this is a huge or a remarkable narrative that the Holy See is now communicating, considering where it came from. So if we keep the spirit of Helsinki in our minds, that for the Holy See was a turning point in the sense of, resorting to diplomacy, dialogue, striving for peace and security. So all the things that the Holy See would wish for the international society. And now here suddenly we see the Holy See as one of the most fervent supporters of dialogue and international institution, international cooperation, suddenly speaking of the impotence, the end of international cooperation. Possibly, or we can debate whether it's by doing that, by using this narrative, perhaps even delegitimizing the United Nations. So what has happened since, sorry, I hope I'm going in the right direction. Since the invasion, the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, is that the Holy See's diplomacy I know this is a bit provocative, but looking at silence studies, we can observe different forms of silence that the Holy See's diplomacy has been adopting. So there's one ongoing pattern that we can observe, and that is for the Catholic Church in particular, or as it's represented in international relations, it refuses to name Russia as an aggressor. This is a pattern that has, this is not news, this is a pattern that continues, and we'll see how Pope Leo XIV continues that narrative or not. He's already spoken to Putin, but so far the narrative has been quite similar to past narratives. That's one element of silence, namely not naming, so refusing to name aggressors. Another form of silence is how a conflict is framed or a war is framed. So rather than focusing, and yes, the Holy See and the Catholic Church mention the Ukraine war a lot, but what it's also been doing, as we see now at international institutions, is framing this entire thing in a bigger picture, saying the international society, the international community is broken. So it's kind of reframing the Ukraine war into something bigger or something different, which is, in silence studies, would also be one form of silence. And then finally, what I find quite interesting here, coming back to the spirit of Helsinki, is that the Holy See, again, is resorting to using a Cold War rhetoric, speaking of great powers, power balancing, a chessboard. And this was different before the Ukraine war. And I'd like to show you how the narrative has changed. So leading up to 2022, February 2022, we see a slightly different narrative of international cooperation. For example, so in the encyclical from 2020, so a couple of years before the full-scale invasion, there was still a clear support or conviction that international cooperation works, and that we have seen how international norms, the application of international norms, prove truly effective. And even before that, we see that Pope Francis called for appeal to the international community to engage in, for example, humanitarian support. This is said during the war in Syria. And this, to me, communicates the full support and also trust in what the international community is capable of doing, in particular international institutions. I'm skipping back now to see how maybe where we've come to and how much of a change or a critical juncture this Ukraine war now signifies. So we've heard about John Paul II several times already during this conference, and I'm sure we will hear more about him. But 1979, so just a couple of years after the Helsinki Final Act, again, being kind of maybe supported or reaffirmed in the value of international institutions, again, there's this confirmation that the United Nations will ever remain the supreme form of peace and justice. And now suddenly we're hearing it's dysfunctional. So there's a very clear change that has happened in the last 50 years. Sorry, I'm skipping. And then perhaps this is one of the most clear let's say, messages that we've heard by a religious leader in an international institution, which I think we're all familiar with, but this was actually prepared by another encyclical by Pope John XXIII, seeing again the United Nations as with the special aim of maintaining and strengthening peace between nations. So what I wanted to show with going backwards is that the foundations are there. At the beginning of when the Holy See joined the United Nations as a permanent observer, it made very clear, not just in its encyclical, so this was a year before, but also afterwards, again and again, supporting the United Nations, international cooperation, and what we might then also call the Helsinki spirit, even naming themselves the self-perception of a servant of the states. So seeing its unique role also as a transnational actor, but also as a religious actor in serving this international order. I'd like to conclude with posing a question, and that's to ask what lessons can be learned from Helsinki 1975, especially for such an important diplomatic actor. I now only very briefly mentioned this, surely provocative observation of being silent. But what I'm arguing the Holy See is silent on is violations of international law. And I think that's a very, very central question to be asked, not just during Helsinki 1975, but also now in international institutions at the OSCE. So the Holy See still is represented there, was there in Malta just last year. What lessons are learned and what does diplomacy mean? Surely not to be silent on violations of international law. And I'd like to end with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And Erik, please.
Thanks. Thanks a lot. Thanks. Does it work? Yeah, perfect. Thanks. This paper is going to be about what I believe is two fairly different kinds of Protestant transnational Protestant networks and how they moved in the spirit of the Helsinki Act. These two networks I have phrased as the networks of the advocates and the networks of the church diplomats. You have heard a little bit about them already from Katharina Kunter. I will rehearse some of their history in order to understand how they moved after 1975 and in the preceding years, and thereby expanding our temporal dimension as well. I'm conscious of the fact that I'm now approaching this topic from a decidedly Western perspective. I apologize in advance for this. The story would, of course, be quite different if I were to narrate this formation from the vantage point of Protestant churches in the European East. Sometimes the East-Western Protestant networks are treated as the progenies of the Cold War, whereas in fact they had already had a long and complex history when the Second World War ended. Already during the early modern era, we can find examples of how representatives of the national Protestant churches offered support to various groups of co-religionists in the East. But it was not until the 1800s that such initiatives were provided with more of an organizational backbone. The impetus came from various groups of evangelical revivalists and Western European Protestant minority groups. They gathered under the banner of religious liberty when forming the International Pan-Protestant Evangelical Alliance in London in 1846. During the first stages of its existence, this organization operated in the spirit of political liberalism of a decidedly Protestant slant. Though never a major political force, it nevertheless came to provide templates for those who were later to see it as their mission to offer support to what they understood to be oppressed Protestants in various parts of Europe. Some of the ethos of advocacy that was found in the Evangelical Alliance was eventually to be channeled through the various Protestant support agencies who had as their direct aim to champion the cause of Protestants in the eastern parts of Europe, primarily in the Russian Empire, later the Soviet Union. I'll return to these groups within short. The Evangelical Alliance was but the first of many international Protestant organizations that emerged in the latter half of the 19th century. Unlike the Evangelical Alliance, these bodies were formed exclusively to cater to the needs of Protestantism's many subspecies, Methodism, Baptism, Congregationalism, and so on. These organizations provided church leaders with an international platform they had previously been lacking. During the gatherings offered under the auspices of these organizations or through their publications, it was possible to exchange information, to discuss differences in doctrine and practice, and of course, to lend both spiritual and a degree of material support to one another. Even more complex and pluralistic arenas began to emerge with what is now commonly known as the ecumenical movement. The many and diverse commissions and committees that were formed by the people drawn to this vision of a renewed Christianity in the first half of the 20th century became arenas in which a particular kind of church diplomatic persona was formed. And in 1948, they formed the World Council of Churches that to many, not only committed Christians, seemed like a beacon of hope. And it is quite interesting, as Katharina Kunter already had mentioned, to see how this church diplomatic persona altered in the 1960s, away from theology into something else. I will say a little bit more about that within short. So at the end of the Second World War, the world of international Protestantism was dominated by people of two different mindsets, advocates and diplomats. To a considerable extent, these two mindsets came to be expressed in the management of distinct organizational/institutional settings. For the sake of clarity of argument, I'm now consciously going to exaggerate the difference between these attitudes. In reality, of course, there was a degree of overlap and a mutual exchange of ideas and practices. First, the advocates. These people espousing this mindset were mostly found among Protestant revivalist groups, notably in the Protestant aid and missionary organizations they supported, but sometimes also within the theological conservative phalanxes of the national churches. They were keen to offer support to, first and foremost, Protestant groups that were badly treated by the communist regimes. They favored contacts with unlicensed or even underground groups. Support came in the form of material aid, when possible, letter writing, but also through various campaigns designed to influence public opinion in Western European societies. As a general rule, they drifted towards the political right, sometimes even the far right, and could expose a virulent anti-communist, Cold Warrior attitude. Secondly, the diplomats. We can find this mindset among the principal players of the ecumenical movement, but also among the leaders of the international denominational organizations, which tended pretty much after the Second World War had ended, actually to be the same people. They were cautious, sometimes too cautious, we might say, in their attitudes, and were fully aware of the intricacies of the Cold War situation. They favored contacts with officially recognized church leaders among the Eastern European Protestants and were thereby brought in the proximity of the leaders of the East European states. During the early phases of the Cold War, these people were seldomly outspoken as to their political views and in general abstained from anti-communist outbursts. the political profile of the generation assuming leadership positions in these organizations during the 1960s and 1970s was increasingly, but not unanimously, progressive, sometimes acknowledging the theological merits of socialism. It is mistaken to say that the people operating within this mindset in general sought to avoid declarations that criticized the religious politics of the communist bloc. Far from it. But when the Russian Orthodox Church became a member of the World Council of Churches in 1961, the dynamic altered. Their freedom to maneuver, so to speak, decidedly became more restricted. So how did people of these two different mindsets and the networks they helped to sustain and manage receive the Final Act of 1975? The responses of the advocates were swift and outspoken. And it is very significant, it's extremely significant that their responses were divergent. One can say that the advocates offered the earliest and clearest responses to the Helsinki Act. They swiftly picked up on the sections on religious liberty, which they, just like some groups of Protestants in the Soviet Union, used as a pretext to push for changes in the European East. Their line of argument was pretty straightforward and quite a lot of times very blunt as well. This is what you have promised. If you do not deliver, you are but two-faced hypocrites. To further enforce their standpoint, the advocates frequently published letters and reports written in the European East, sometimes smuggled to the West, to demonstrate how little had changed after 1975. They sensed that there was a momentum. Now the ball should keep rolling, so to speak. And I actually believe that some of these people sensed that there was a quest for legitimacy in the contemporary Soviet Union. In comparison to the advocates, the response of the diplomats to the Helsinki Agreement was more convoluted. They found the attitudes and the confrontational style of the advocates vexing, just as the advocates were embarrassed at the taciturnity of the diplomats when it came to religious liberty issues. To understand the responses, one must bear in mind that they, at this time, also were preoccupied with the post-colonial situation. The global dimension steps forward when we sort of look at these people. But they were also involved in various attempts to find a third way between East and West, which in the early years of the 1970s materialized in various attempts to build connections from below through various forms of low-level exchanges and contacts. Therefore, these people were prone to focus on the sections in the Helsinki Act that talked of freedom of movement. The agreement of 1975 seemed to be another step towards the building of a world in which low-level cross-border encounters would be instrumental in fostering mutual trust. So, in conclusion, one might say that these networks and the people who struggled to sustain them both operated in the spirit of Helsinki. But perhaps one might also say that this spirit assumed different shapes and forms, as is often the case when political events move on into the civil society sector. When expressed by these people, the spirit of Helsinki morphed in many ways. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, dear presenters, for your fascinating presentations in this post-lunch context. And we will move now to the more dynamic part of this session. So maybe I could raise a question to Sarah. Thank you for your presentation and also for pointing out to the religious inspirators around the Helsinki Act. If I recall correctly, you mentioned a couple of male inspirators, right? So that might raise the question, how about possible female inspirators. Could you say something about that?
It's already on. Great, wonderful. In my book, I talk a lot about female human rights activists. And one of the things that Jerry Leiber, who was an American woman who was the head of Helsinki Watch in the United States, said is that as a woman, when she applied for permission to go to the Soviet Union, she was not seen as very threatening. So she was able to go to people's kitchens and sit with them and talk with them, and she was able to be very effective in terms of building transnational connections because the Soviets just saw her as a housewife. They didn't realize that she was going to end up leading what would become really a powerhouse organization on behalf of human rights. And I see that in the Soviet context as well, that there were a number of incredibly prominent female human rights activists, people like Yelena Bonner, Andrei Sakharov's wife, Lyudmila Alexeyeva. But by and large, they connected to Helsinki through a broader concern for human rights. They weren't people who came to the movement through religious affiliation or religious activism, even if some of them were deep believers, but they didn't identify maybe first as religious activists. I think they thought that the strength was in a broader emphasis on human rights. So within the world of Helsinki activism, at least, there are many women. Certainly if we look at the photos of the signatories of the Helsinki Final Act, that stage was far less diverse. But women played a key role in many aspects of Helsinki activism, even if they may not have been as closely identified with their religious faith in the research that I've done.
Thank you so much for this clear overview, and that's fascinating in itself. I might have also questions to every speaker, but I would like to move to the audience and to include you in our conversation. So it's time for Q&A, and this time it's an inclusive and diverse Q&A, if you allow me, in the sense that it's not only for questions, but also to share maybe narratives or comments, feedback, and as we heard this morning, maybe also a joke. So please, 1, 2, 3, and then we come back to the speakers. Yes, please.
Yes, thank you for the very interesting presentations. I have 2 questions/comments. The first has to do with what about the peace movement? I mean, certainly in the communist states, they like to cooperate with the churches to especially establish peace in Western Europe and Western disarmament, trying to stop the station of US Euro missiles. And of course, they were very active in trying to use the churches or cooperate with the churches, if you will, to get them to support sort of the Soviet line on disarmament. And I was just wondering if that played a role here, but that was also something, for example, in East Germany, the church said, oh, we can play a constructive role in the Helsinki Final Act. Some of the diplomats, if you will, as opposed to the advocates, were saying, well, let's support the line of peace that's being supported by the party. And secondly, I mean, Katharina mentioned 2 organizations, the World Council of Churches and the Council of European Churches. Certainly, the communist parties, before each of these meetings, they would have all of the Soviet bloc, all of their representatives from the church division of the party would meet and try to coordinate what the people would say there, who was allowed to go, try to control them that way. And also the state security services would also have a multilateral meeting where they would all say, well, these are the problem people we need to deal with, and we can trust this person, that person not. I was just wondering to what extent they were successful in sort of instrumentalizing this, or is that, yeah. That's my question.
Okay, thank you. Yes, please.
Yes, I was very surprised that none of the 5 speakers mentioned the biggest case of religious repression at that time, and that was in Ukraine. And particularly, I was surprised at Professor Snyder, completely ignoring the fact that actually religious repression increased after the Helsinki Agreement was signed. The decade between the Helsinki Agreement and Gorbachev coming on the scene was the actually worst period of political and religious repression in Ukraine since the Stalin era. The two largest underground churches in the Soviet Union were in Ukraine, Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church and Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Why was this ignored from the talks, and particularly from your talk? On to Katharina, the Vatican, during this period of time of religious repression in Ukraine, was very silent on Ukraine. The Vatican, Ukrainians were actually very disillusioned by how the Vatican was actually often in bed with the Russian Orthodox Church during that period of time, and in fact since. It rarely criticized this religious repression in Ukraine. In fact, despite the fact that the Ukrainian Catholic Church was the biggest underground church in the world at that time. And so if we're talking about reviving the Helsinki process, I don't think many Ukrainians are going to be happy about that, because this period of time is not something to remember in a positive way. The decade from 75 to 85 was a pretty dark period in Soviet domestic repression. Bringing this to the contemporary era, this has important ramifications, which again I'm surprised nobody brought out. The Russian Orthodox Church is a full-throated supporter of the war against Ukraine. It calls it a holy war to reclaim Russian land. The roots of that go back to this period that was ignored by the panel, and that is that the Russian Orthodox Church was revived by Stalin in 1943 as the Church of the Eastern Slavs, not as a Church of Russia, Church of Ukrainians, Russians, and Belarusians. And so the Russian Orthodox Church, hence, was in bed with the Soviet regime and is now in bed with Putin. I think this is important to understand as one of the drivers of the genocidal war against Ukraine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And here.
I'm very interested in your talk later. But I would like to add some short points which Katharina Kunter couldn't tell, even she was researching it in writing books about that. But you have not enough time. But I think it is important, if you look to Germany, East Germany, then it is important to understand that in our case, churches were institutional, completely independent. The state had no direct influence in the acting of the church. Even financial, we benefited from the western part of the churches, and it was a very important dimension of that independency. The half-time of GDR from 1949 to 69, the churches, the Protestant churches in East Germany were part of EKD, the Evangelical Church of Deutschland, institutional. It was difficult to really to implement, but institutional. We belonged to the same institution. And it continued with institutional links. That meant, by that independency, churches, the Protestant churches in East Germany, could play such an important role for the opposition in the 70s and the 80s, which is totally different with Czechoslovakia, for instance, or with Hungary. I think I'd just like to mention it. The second point is there was an important dimension with the so-called conciliar process, which is an ecumenical one from Vancouver, the World Council of Churches, 1983, which was not just a German issue, because, or even it was initiated by both Germans. But I think it is important that in our case, in East Germany, the political issues of peace, justice, freedom, prevailing of the Schöpfung, I don't know, the environmental issues, to raise that political question as questions of political belief. This was difficult for many groups, even in the church, to convince the leaders and some bishops that this is a question of belief. And this was an important issue in the end of the 80s, and not only in Germany, but I will remind you that in Basel, before the fall of the wall, there was an European ecumenical movement. And my experience, I was a member there, was to experience, before the fall of the wall, citizens from all over of Europe, and not only diplomats, on one place. And I think this was a marvelous event.
Thank you. We go now to the responses to the first speaker. Who wants to respond to the first speaker? Katharina?
Thank you. That's actually a very valid point, which would help underline this pattern of diplomacy that the Holy See has been following since, at very latest, Helsinki 1975. And I would then argue, perhaps, or question what lessons has it learned for what diplomacy it conducts, because clearly the Final Act, but also maybe the Paris Charter, could not prevent, or did not prevent, as we heard yesterday already, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So clearly some lessons need to be learned, or something needs to be reconsidered or overhauled, and maybe not just a revival of the Helsinki spirit, but maybe a completely new approach to what the Helsinki spirit means. So thank you very much for that point.
Maybe I follow in that point about some words about the Russian Orthodox Church in the World Council of Churches and also in the whole context. I think you are right. The peace movement played a distinctive role in framing, let's say, the new idea about East-West détente and dialogue from the World Council of Churches. And definitely we see nowadays, if we are going into the secret files, that more or less I would say all the high ecumenical representatives in the ecumenical movement were more or less instrumentalized by the KGB or the Secret Service. And they tried to convince the people in the ecumenical movement from their political aims and goals. And that was definitely the case in the Conference of European Churches, why they were starting so early to support the CSCE in '66, because it was directly coming from Moscow. But this is only, let's say, until the end of the Cold War, and even today we see the idea that, especially in the Orthodox Church is foreign policy in the ecumenical movement, and they use the ecumenical movement as a soft tool for propagating their foreign policy ideas. I think we can see that, but that is only, let's say, one part of the story, because we also see on the other side in the ecumenical movement and in the churches in the 1970s, they had the turn towards socialistic ideas. And that is a feature of the period, that we have more social democratic governments, that we had openness towards Latin America, that we had openness in the theological area to liberation theology. And we see people from Latin America being staff persons in the ecumenical movement and trying up to open social ethics towards a very secular language, towards a more social orientated activism, and with a very, let's say, just to try to say it neutral, with a sympathy for socialistic ideas, and also with the idea for maybe also social democratic ideas, but also a sympathy for justice, in opposite maybe to the old narrative, which was much more about freedom in the 1950s and 60s. So we have a generation gap in between, a new generation, and it would not be correct to say that the whole churches who were busy in the ecumenical movement were just instrumentalized by Moscow, because there was the other half, and the other half was more or less convinced that the left way is the right way. So they were supporting the other state-conforming church representatives in their way, even if they had different ideas about the world and what a just world looks like in the future. But I think that is important to see. And then the whole peace movement, I think it can be very, the GDR is a very good field to study the impact, and you know that best. There was the official peace movement. And of course, there were some Christians active in the official peace movement of the GDR, also in other countries, also in Finland. And there was also kind of official peace movement. But there was also the bottom-up independent peace movement in the GDR, where a lot of critical Christians were supporting a peace which was not the framing in the in the Soviet case. So I think that is the ambiguity of the whole heritage of the Helsinki process, that we cannot just be so one-sided in our judgment. And maybe a last word to the Russian Orthodox Church. In my point of view, I think we have a very long history or narrative of the Russian Orthodox Church and the World Council of Churches. The Russian Orthodox Churches was a member in the World Council of Churches since 1961, and already in 1975, after the signing of the Helsinki Accord, they had a big clash with the dissidents in the General Assembly, and finally the World Council of Churches leadership, not from communist countries, from Latin America and Western European countries, decided to appease with the Russian Orthodox Church. Just they wanted to have, let's say, the unity, and they wanted to have the Russian Orthodox Church as a member in the World Council of Churches. And I think you can see this line till today. Even still today, I still would say the World Council of Churches has a problem with the Russian Orthodox Church. And this is also remarkable because on the other way, since the 1960s, the World Council of Churches was always supporting decolonizing countries, and they always had a sensibility what it does mean to come from a colonial context and find their own independent way in terms of Asia and Africa and the new churches. But they did not make this, let's say, this jump in the 21st century, and agreeing that now in the post-Soviet time, the decolonization of the Russian Orthodox Church and the legacy is also an issue. So they never made that, and still today, Ukrainian and Belarus is not represented as churches in the World Council of Churches. It's still the Russian Orthodox Church speaking for all these churches.
Thank you, Katharina. Maybe Sarah could quickly respond to the question of him, and then we have the final question to the lady in the back. Yes,
sure,
please.
Thank you. So I talked about Anatoly Sharansky as a member of the Moscow-Helsinki group. I didn't have time to talk about how Helsinki groups developed in multiple other places in the Soviet Union as well, Lithuania, Georgia, and Ukraine. This is a period of time in which there was a flowering of human rights activism in the Soviet Union, but it does not mean that that activism was not met with repression. Sharansky was arrested. Yuri Orlov, who was the head of the Moscow-Helsinki group, was arrested and imprisoned for a long time. People went into exile, and by the early 1980s, at least the Moscow-Helsinki group was effectively silenced. So it's not surprising to me that a time of activism would be met by increased repression in various republics of the Soviet Union.
Thank you. Final question. And then we move to the coffee break.
My name, I'm working at the OSCE Academy in the far, far, far east, where the OSCE ends. And that's where my direction is going to. I understand this as religion and the Helsinki process, and I'm wondering from the researchers who have looked more into depth the role of religion as a counter project for many in the former Soviet Union to the socialist communist ideology. And I'm talking particularly about the Muslim groups and congregations, and not only in Central Asia, but also in the Caucasus, and to what extent they might have been inspired by that too, knowing or not knowing, conscious or unconsciously, by the focus that religion plays a role as we have discussed here, not only as a counter movement, as a human rights movement, but I'm wondering if there's any research on the role of Muslim religious groups, because I know from my experience working in Central Asia that they played a significant role in opposing the regime, whether they wanted it or not, but they were constantly targeted by the Soviet regime, and many of them were slaughtered and put into gulags for their faith because they were threatening the regime. And I'm wondering how, or whether there's anything that we can connect to the Helsinki process, particularly in the 1980s. Just curious from this perspective. And of course, there are many more religious groups in the former Soviet Union.
Yes, and thank you for bringing that in, the notion of the non-Christian faith communities. Anyone who could briefly say something?
I could start,
Erik?
perhaps. Yeah, I don't think that there has been so much done on that. That's a very interesting topic, I think. I think that the people I sort of put under the label of advocates, very Protestant people, as you've heard, I think they had a kind of awareness. They know what was happening in Ukraine, and they also were quite aware of what was happening to the Muslims, which is quite surprising. But if you follow their publications, you can see that they had reports and they were able to publish some sort of basic information what was happening to these people as well, which I believe this needs to be sort of further studies. Thanks a lot for that question.
Reka, final sentence.
Just a very short remark concerning the peace movement, because I think it has two levels. The first, you may know the Prague-based church. What was the? Yes, the Christian Peace Conference, which was actually a kind of, a very soft organization. There is a picture of 16 delegates from Hungary. All of them were the agent of the secret services. But probably which is more important, and this is what I wanted to mention, the instrumentalization, not only the churches, but the exploitation of the theological doctrine. And the peace movements used the theological doctrine of the Christian churches in order to support the official communist propaganda. And I think this is a quite huge topic we should talk about later. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think we all have learned that we have a lot to study from the issue of religion connected with human rights and the Helsinki process. And we can see that one word may mean very different things. If you think about the word peace, for example, and context is important, and how you use certain word or some idea. And so I think that we will continue the process of studying the relations between religion, human rights, and society in general. And I wish you all luck in this, and thank you all for participating. And once again, thank you all for our panelists.